Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode. I'm Brianne Hendrickson, and today I have with me Dick Wittman with us to talk about the transitioning of the family farm, and he is also a fifth-generation farmer. First, why don't you just tell us about yourself and what you do? I do know that you're retired, per se. I'm going to put quotes around that, but kind of tell us what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Well, the first response is I am not retired. I have transitioned. And there's a huge difference between the term retirement and transition. And I think that's one of the obstacles that family farm businesses face is farming is much different today than it was 50 years ago, where people had a career, they retired from actively working in a career. The size of the business financially was not significantly such that they couldn't either sell for a reasonable amount or gift the business and had financial security. Today, we have multi-million-dollar businesses where the capital required to be sustainable is often owned by multiple players. The transition of management, where people are ready to let others take a share of the management load, it's not just one, it's multiple people. It's management transition is almost completely disconnected from ownership transition because, and very much like our situation, the senior members of the business may be the capital providers that will continue to provide capital long past their active engagement as managers. And the transition of ownership may occur in a combination of buyouts, gifting, transferring of the business at death. So it's a longer term scenario. So because many people that are transitioning out of management roles are having to still stay involved as capital providers, you can't completely disconnect from business. So that's why I use the term transition as opposed to retirement. Whereas in our case, and like many businesses like ours, the senior managers are transitioning management to an incoming generation. And then we're looking at a longer term transition of ownership where we may transition from board or from manager or CEO to board chair or transition coach. So we're still working, we're just wearing a different hat. And defining that hat and establishing boundaries of what you do and don't do when you become a board chair or mentor coach are one of the biggest challenges we have in large businesses today. So that's just a quick clarification of the difference between transition and retirement. And I see a lot of people, the retirement becomes an obstacle of them making effective transitions.
So do you think using the word transition instead of retired, it helps the success of the whole transition to the next generation instead of just saying, I'm retired, where people kind of really do just step away, where you're transitioning and you're still there to help them, coach them, and whatnot? Have you seen better success with using that term and actually staying on board kind of in a way?
Absolutely, if it's done well. I use the term career path a lot in our workshops, where I'll ask people, what's a typical career path in a farm? And it's you start out as a grunt, and then you might become an assistant manager. And then if the old goat dies off, you get to be boss or manager. And then I'll say, and then what? And the crowd will look at me like, duh, you have to die. And they laugh, and then I laugh, and I say, you're not thinking this through. There's another step in the career path of a business. There's that board chair, that transition coach. There's a career beyond being the boss, the CEO, the general manager. And if you only see your career as capped off as being the boss, and you define your success as ending there, and you're healthy and you love agriculture and you enjoy the business, you aren't going to let go. But if you see that that's just one more step beyond that, and how do I make that step gracefully? How do we figure out how to take our job seriously of grooming our successor? And then once we have that successor in place, how do we set new expectations of what that person's job is and what your job isn't anymore, but what what do you do differently? Um, Things in terms of looking effectively at strategic planning, looking at policy structures that need to change as new generations coming in. How do you look at an intentional grooming process for the next manager so they'll succeed? How do you set expectations for that new manager that says, now you're boss, it doesn't mean I'm going to run I'm going to run this, get out of my way. If other people in that business are furnishing the bulk of the capital, you can have a really important leadership role, but it doesn't mean you're not accountable to something. And so creating reasonable expectations of accountability to the incoming successor, to who is the ownership of the business, are a key part of that transition training process.
So you're fifth. There's 5 generations within your farm company. Um,
Well, let's back up. I am fourth generation,
okay.
and the fifth generation is now on the ground farming. So actually, I'm third generation. Our kids are running the business today. They're fourth generation, and they have children that could be the fifth generation. So we in effect have fifth generation in the wings who will someday have to decide: is this what they want to do for a career? Is this what they want to do for an investment?
Um, let's talk about your transition from taking it on, and then after that, let's talk about transitioning it to your kids. Um, what was it like taking it over or transitioning it to you?
Well, we've had an interesting history where my dad and two uncles farmed together as co-leaders in a business where their transition plan was their dad passing away when my dad was only a senior in high school. So there was no long-term somebody holding onto the wheel. It was marching two young kids to the bank saying, here's a signature card, you're the boss now. And so they had a long time to be leaders and they got the chance to make decisions. And so they were probably ready for transition more so than many other businesses where people didn't get the chance to take over leadership roles until later in life. But we had a really, uh, while it was not written on paper, there was a very clear difference or division of responsibilities where we had clear leadership roles for a manager of the cattle. One partner managed the crops, the other partner managed the shop operations and equipment. And there was a lot of mutual respect. But because they worked together, there was a lot of clarity on how they operated, how they were governed, how they respected roles, and so forth. Um, I worked outside the farm for 8 years with Farm Credit, where I did a lot of training, a lot of coaching with other businesses in this whole field, and had actually come back to help my dad and uncles professionalize the process of my brother and cousin coming into the business because they were simply paid employees and they wanted to advance that to more of a management role and set up a path for ownership. And in the process of coaching them through that process, we mutually concluded that there was a role that I could play that they wanted me to play. So we had a cowboy, we had a farmer, and I had a business management kind of finance marketing expertise that helped fill out the team. So that was in 1980. And so we left a lending career. And at the same time, I had a lot of people I'd worked with encourage me to set up a consulting business. So there was mutual support from the farm partners for me to do that. So for the last almost 45 years, I wore a dual role of managing a farm business and also doing consulting work. And it ranged everything from financial consulting to family business governance and putting professional practices in place. And in the early 80s, the concept of professional governance wasn't even a label that was on people's radar screens. Farming was very informal. There was seldom an organization chart that was defined. There was not written job descriptions. There were no written policies. Seldom did you see written standard operating procedures that people were expected to follow. It was just an informal business. And it didn't mean that this structure didn't exist. It was just in people's heads. And when something's in other people's heads, the assumption that everybody sees it the same way is not valid. Um, it's in the process of getting people to say, well, what's your understanding of my job and what's my understanding of your job? Once you commit that to paper, you realize, oh my gosh, we have some conflicts here. We have some voids. And so I started seeing the opportunity in agriculture to put the same professional structures in place that I had been used to in the lending world, where you probably see this in your career. You'd never dream of going to work for a business where they don't say, here's your job description, here's your salary structure, here's when you get your first performance evaluation, here are opportunities for career advancement and training. Those are just standard in a business world, but outside of in agriculture, that was a language that didn't exist. So I not only saw an opportunity, ag, to help advance that, but our farm became a laboratory to practice what I preach. So we started putting a lot of these disciplines in place. And I'll tell you, looking back over the last 45 years, if people ask me what is the number one thing that you attribute to your success over time, I will tell them it's a complete team commitment to running a business in a professional fashion. And then that begs the question, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to say I'm a professionally managed business? It's just putting clarity into what is your mission, your vision, and what are your core values? What are the roles that people play in the business, and how do those roles interact and come together in the form of an org chart where you know to whom you're accountable? What are the reporting lines? And it doesn't mean that people, are dictators of their own little empires or silos. It just gives direction as to where are you the lead and how do you approach excellence and what it is you're trying to lead, instead of a committee approach where mediocrity is the end result of a committee structure. If everybody's responsible for everything, nobody's responsible for anything. And so these are principles that have proven themselves in the business world. We as a team are not perfect, but we all as a team, and the next generation has as a team, fully embraced the importance of professionally managed processes. That means sound planning, very transparent processes for operational and strategic planning, clarity in roles, clarity in our policies in terms of compensation, and many other areas where how do we guide how we make business decisions. Those processes are structured. They're not just left at the whims of how do we feel today.
How do you know when it's time to start that transition? Because I mean, you don't just wake up dead and it's transition. When do you say, okay, like, we need to start? Because this isn't a process that just happens overnight. It's
I
a
tell people, I love this
long
question.
process.
I love this question because the answer of when it's not is not when you get your first heart attack or the first time you have a big fight and the next generation says, if you don't give me more responsibility, I'm quitting. That's not when you start succession planning. I tell people it starts when your potential heirs or your successors are really young and you give them a job, like, I want you to go out and gather the eggs, or I want you to go clean the barn out. And they ask you, are you going to pay me? It's how you answer that question is when succession planning starts. If you say not no, hell no, you snot-nosed little kid, you're getting free room and board, go gather the eggs, you probably have not started positively on succession planning. But if you say, that's a good question. We want you to know what our philosophy is about what your expectations are as a family member, but what your potential role could be as an employee. And if you're interested in earning money, that's good. So for today, No, we're not going to pay you to gather the eggs because that's part of your expectations of being a part of our household. But if you're interested in a job and pay, we have a policy that says we pay fair market value for whatever jobs are done, regardless if you're family or not. So when you're ready, let's sit down and talk about jobs that you have skills to do, like sweeping shop floors or sorting bolts, and we will set up an hourly rate and we'll figure out how many hours that you have available after you get your homework done. And if you want to be an employee, let's set up a process. That's when succession planning starts. Because the point of this discussion is for most family businesses, you are running your children's first business school. And you think about this, you're teaching lessons every day that you don't even realize. And you're either teaching bad lessons or you're teaching good lessons. But never forget that you are running a school of business that are probably the first business rules and experiences your kids will ever experience. So starting out early in life of being transparent about finances and sharing with your kids, here's how the business is running, and here's well, you need to know what the challenges we are. We need to know what our successes are so that if someday if you want to be an investor, it's not a big secret. You need to know what our structure is for people who work here and what their expectations are and how people are paid. And we're not going to live, we don't want you to live our dreams. We want you to look at the farm as a potential employer someday, but not expect you to do that. If that's not in your DNA and you don't want to do it, great. But if you're interested, here are the job opportunities, here are the job descriptions, here are the pay scales. So the sooner you have that structure and you can share with them what that is, you're setting a foundation for succession planning where you can have a conversation. And unfortunately, many of these conversations are kept secret or they're not even addressed until people are far too far down the road. So sooner rather than later. And I tell people one of the biggest challenges people have is work. How do you get it started? And if you look at the value of having a family meeting where you simply talk about what is the process of transition, what are the decisions that we as, say, mom and dad have to have made someday, and help them to understand the decisions that have to get made, maybe some of the considerations that you're already ready to share with in terms of our openness to anybody looking at this as a career, or maybe we're only going to let the boys work here, or we're not going to let anybody work here that isn't family. Or maybe you say, I don't care if you're family or if you're a son-in-law, that's family as well. It's people have the right skill sets and the right fit with our business values that are potentially employable in our business. It's answering those questions so the next generation can set reasonable expectations on whether or not they want to participate are key parts of launching the succession planning process.
So let's talk about you transitioning for your kids. I'm sure my dad's a farmer. So I kind of know it's not easy for y'all to just step away in a sense, and I mean you're not really stepping away, you're helping the transition, but you do stop doing certain things. You know, what have you done to help? I don't want to say fill a void, but you wake up and you go do what you did for several years, and now you don't get to do that every single day. What are those steps looking like?
Great question. Well, I tell people it's way easier to consult with others on what to do than have to practice this yourself. Because even when you know things you shouldn't do after you pass the baton, it's hard to sit in like the control tower in an airport. It's hard to be in that seat and then watch others make those decisions, knowing that, well, you wouldn't do it that way, or you would do it quicker, or why did you do that? So it really requires a lot of patience to step back and say, okay, our generation was given a lot of leeway to make mistakes, and we need to figure out how to do that same thing with the next generation. One of the biggest challenges is if you're fully thinking, well, I'm going to come to work just like I always did, but I'm wearing a different hat now, and I'm just here to help, what is in other people's minds? And the fact is, what they're thinking about is totally different than what you're thinking. They're thinking, I thought he retired. Why doesn't he just go away? Is he here to boss us again? He's watching everything we do. So visibility is a huge issue in this transition. So we've had to have, well, our daughter, who's the farm CEO, and I've had a lot of number of really honest discussions about um, what is the visibility issue. So I intentionally do not go to the shop when they do planning meetings. I don't want them to have me in the room judging what their plan is or even having them think that I'm part of that process. That's their job. Now, after their meeting, if there's something that I need to work on, then they give me some marching orders. Or I may have suggestions of things that need to be done that I could work on, but I'm completely in a different role now where I'm not making the plan. I'm just like part-time help, where they may choose to say, we don't need for that job to get done. So don't worry about it. And that's a learning process where I think the number one thing that's come out of some of these discussions is that everybody wants it to work. So if the incoming and outgoing operations agree right up front, there's going to be anxiety, but if each party says, I want you to give me grace and I'm going to give you grace, that our intentions are good, but the way we execute may not be the most ideal. And let's look at the intentions and don't make assumptions that I'm still trying to hold on to my job. And you don't make assumptions that I'm judging you just because I'm pulling in the shop yard. Don't be so overly sensitive that everybody there is thinking he's watching what we're doing. He's looking for us to screw up. That's not what this is about. Sometimes, I mean, I coach a lot of retiring CEOs where one of their biggest grieving processes is now that they're no longer making those day-to-day decisions, they want to be valued. I have a client who we worked at over a couple of years getting their two sons to buy this client out. And he has a wealth of knowledge. But they never ask him for his opinion about anything. And so it's like, they don't value my opinion. I must be worthless. And I'm going, no. They're just trying to prove to you that they can do this. But on the same token, I have to sit with these boys and kind of beat them over the head and say, it's not that hard once in a while, even though the answer, just to ask Dad, what do you think about this? You don't understand how much that means to people who've been in that job, just to be asked once in a while, what would you have done? Because that's what coaching is about. And if you're not allowed to coach, if you're just shut off cold turkey, then what happens is you insert yourself when you're not wanted. That makes sense?
Yeah.
And so by creating an orderly process for asking for input once in a while, you're actually just servicing the need for people to feel valued. And sometimes you learn something by asking a question, or you might save a little bit. And I think nobody wants to see transitions fail. They don't want to see money wasted or inefficiency in a business. But you have to allow, as a mentor and a coach, you have to allow other people some leeway to fail. Otherwise, they never learn. And as long as the size of the mistake isn't catastrophic, as an investor in the business, you have to be willing to live with that. And that's part of the equation I think the incoming generation often doesn't appreciate is as long as you're still invested in the business, their inefficiency, you're footing the bill for that. Once you're totally bought out and they're gambling with their marbles, then it's not going to impact you financially other than maybe getting your rental payment. And so you have to say, there's no consequence to me. It's totally on you, the impact of your decision.
For premium content, you can head over to the Comstock Report, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button.